A sermon for the first Sunday after Trinity. If you asked most Christians who Jesus raised to life, the most likely answer you'll get is Lazarus. Everybody remembers the great faith of Mary and Martha, his miraculous emergence after 3 days in a tomb, and Jesus is called to the onlookers, "Loose him, let him go." But here in today's Gospel reading we have another miraculous resurrection, but this time without much of a fanfare or comment, and according to the text, without much faith from the boy's mother. The whole incident is described in 6 verses. So how significant is this miracle? And what about the importance of faith? Let's see if our readings can help us answer these questions. Our Old Testament reading involves Elijah and the widow at Zarephath. Elijah was one of the most colourful characters in the Old Testament, used by God at a time when spirituality was at an all-time low. He was God's prophet to the northern tribes during the reign of King Ahab, who had the distinction of doing more evil in the eyes of God than any other king before him. The country was experiencing a severe drought, and the king blamed Elijah for it and wanted him dead. It was while Elijah was running for his life that he was sent by God to the widow, who with God's help would make sure he had ample food to survive the drought. Everything was going well. They had every expectation of surviving as expected. But then tragedy strikes, and the widow's son dies. It must have turned into the darkest day of her life. Her whole future rested on her son. She turned on Elijah and accused him with his connection with God for her problems. "What made you interfere, you man of God? You came here to bring my sins to light and caused my son's death." She believed that they often did in Old Testament times, that death and sickness was a punishment for some past or hidden sin, and that's how now has been brought to light because of her sins. Whenever something bad happens, even though we know God is right there helping us through our rough spots, like the widow, instead of appreciating him, we sometimes blame him for what has happened. First, the widow had given up her food for him. Now it seems she would have to give up her son. It's at darkest moments like this that God's light shines the brightest. Elijah took the problem straight to God, and through his grace the boy lived and was raised from the dead. The woman said to Elijah, "Now I know for certain you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is true." This is a story of increasing faith. When we pass through tough times, when a loved one dies, it's never a form of punishment, but in such situations we experience the full force of God's love, and this brings us closer to him, which is what happened to our widow in this story. And it's only when we come to the end of our own resources and we have used up what resistance we have that we begin to recognize our great need for God. This is the first resurrection example in the Old Testament, and it shows the immense power of prayer. Responding to tragedy in faith brings growth. Responding to tragedy with prayer brings results. Responding to tragedy through Jesus provides us with a new beginning. Which leads us on to our New Testament lesson, the experience of Paul and the Galatian church. In her early term as Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher made a proud boast that was to become a trademark catchphrase: "The lady is not for turning." Whether at the time this was a sign of strength or weakness is a matter of debate. There are times, however, when we all need to listen to others, explore other avenues, or even change direction altogether. That was certainly the case for Paul. Through his dramatic conversion on the Damascus Road, Paul came to realize that despite his persecution of the church, God's grace was still at work in his life. And although he started to climb the wrong ladder, he had been brought back to the right one by Jesus, who called him to preach to the Gentiles. Our first steps are important and exciting, whether it's those first steps walking, riding a bicycle, or learning to read, starting a new job. And when we take our first steps with Jesus, he will lead us on to the long walk of the obedience to him and his gospel. The world may judge us about our past, but God sees us for what we can be transformed into by his love and his Son and his Spirit. Conversion to faith for us may have been a far less dramatic experience than it was for Paul, but nonetheless there is a real need for change for all of us. The need to turn our backs on our old self and embrace our new self in God. As with Paul, it's not just about moving away from our former ways, it's about moving towards Christ. It takes courage to accept that all is not as it should be, to commit ourselves to a life of discipleship, and it takes more courage still, having made those initial steps, to recognise that the job is far from finished and only just started. Some of us, like Paul, respond to lessons that stop us in our toes, stir our hearts to a higher level commitment to Jesus. But others, like the widow in our gospel reading, shows little outward faith at all. The gospel reading takes us into one of the 4 funeral scenes in the New Testament. This one is about the funeral of a young man from Nain, a small village 20 miles south of Capernaum, where Jesus had just preached to the crowds the day before. Let's imagine that we are in that funeral party. It's a hot day. The professional mourners are there, the wailers making plenty of noise so that the friends and relatives, especially the mother, can cry their hearts out without embarrassment. And the people to anoint the body, ready to wrap him up in the grave clothes, are walking with us also. We make our way through the streets to the town gate. This death has touched everyone. The family plot is a little way out of town in a small cave beside the hill. A husband and father had been buried there some time ago. Then, quite suddenly, some strangers arrive. A man leading a small group of followers. He seems vaguely familiar. Perhaps he grew up in a neighbouring village. He seems strangely stirred by what he sees, comes up and talks to the widow. Then, to everyone's surprise, he touches the bier, the coffin. Nobody except the official bearers should touch the coffin. It would make them unclean. Then, the biggest shock of all, he's telling the boy to get up. And he's getting up. The whole procession is going wild with astonishment, delight and disbelief. We don't know who to look at, the no longer dead boy, the ecstatic mother, or this stranger who has done what the old prophets Elijah and Elisha used to do. Is this the prophet we've been waiting for? Is this the time when God has come near to save and rescue us? This story in Luke is about resurrection and healing. Jesus is the supreme source of life, and he has the power to turn things around. Jesus is using this funeral to signal a new life and hope to a hurting world. Without even the presence of faith, Jesus gave this woman her back her son. This reminds us that although he loves to see signs of faith in us, Jesus isn't always bound by them. And here he acts out of sheer compassion to do something that nobody had imagined he would or could do. In this story, the only person who has faith that the dead man can be raised is Jesus himself. In Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, Mowgli, the man cub, asks the animals, "What's the most feared thing in the jungle?" He is told that when 2 animals meet on a narrow path, one must step aside to let the other pass. The animal that steps aside for no one would then be the most feared. First he was told this was an elephant. Another told him it was a lion, but a wise old owl explained, "The most feared thing in the jungle is death. It steps aside for no one." In our hearts we all know that we each must feel the sting of death. and with every tick of the second hand it grows nearer. Our loved ones die, our friends, our children, and in our gospel reading we meet a woman to whom death has dealt a double blow. But even though death didn't step aside for her, it stepped aside for Jesus. Jesus cares about our pain and wants to help us, and there is no pain, no hurt that does not go unnoticed by him. Jesus has the power even over death to bring hope to hopeless situations. We don't have to be firm in faith or behave in a certain way to receive his help. We just need to trust in his amazing power and love. The resurrection at Nain, like the resurrection of Lazarus, points us to the coming death and resurrection of Jesus and his offer of eternal life and saving love. It also shows us what this life looks like on the ground. God's love going out in a new and unexpected healing way. Like Elijah before him, Jesus is seen as the new prophet of God, and more than that, the promised Messiah who has brought God's saving grace into our world. Our faith, important as it is and as it grows, is not the measure by which Jesus, gives life that rests solely with Jesus. The one who can say that rests solely with Jesus, the one who can say, I am the resurrection and the life. Amen.